1, 2, 3, and... Hey, this is Mike McCusker back with Episode 7, Part 2, ThinkyBrain Revisited, a conversation I recorded with Brian Allstat in the summer of 2015 for the podcast, ThinkyBrain, we were doing at the time. We're going to pick the conversation right back up where we left it, talking about complex adaptive systems, randomness, predictability, anti-fragility, the line between inner and outer, agency versus free will, attachment and how to let go of our attachments, the true meaning of Zen and meditation. We talk about God, we talk about evolution, we talk about, we talk about a lot of things. And just a side note, if anyone is looking for a present for Brian for Christmas this year, I think an electron microscope would be a wonderful gift for him. And I think he would treasure it. All right, let's get back into it. This is BlindSpots, Episode 7, Part 2, ThinkyBrain Revisited. So you have the quote.
I have the quote, and it's a long quote, but you can edit it down if you need to. A complex adaptive system has no single governing equation or rule that controls the system. Mm-hmm. Instead, it has many distributed interacting parts with little or nothing in the way of central control. Each of the parts is governed by its own rules. By the way, that's true of the human body. Most rules can be parsed into simple action, condition action rules, blah, 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 blah. Where is the nugget here?
Search for it and let me jump in with something while you're looking for it, and then when you have it, hold on to it, because I can piece this together. Ultimately, though, Brian, I think that even though the layers sort of build off of each other and become increasingly more complex, at its heart, we can boil everything down to...
Here it is.
Go for it.
It is interesting to note that we rarely think of anticipation or prediction as a characteristic of organisms in general. Though we readily ascribe it to humans, still a bacterium moves in the direction of a chemical gradient, implicitly predicting, in time, that food lies in that direction. The foul-tasting monarch butterfly survives because it implicitly forecasts that a certain wing pattern discourages predators. A wolf bases its actions on anticipations generated by a mental map that incorporates landmarks and scents, and can anticipate events on the order of minutes and hours. It is important that we understand the way in which complex adaptive systems build and use internal models. So much of their behavior stems from anticipations based on these internal models. And here is the key paragraph. An internal model allows a system to look ahead to the future consequences of current actions without actually committing itself to those actions. In particular, the system can avoid acts that would set it irretrievably down some road to future disaster, stepping off of a cliff. Less dramatically, but equally important, the model enables the agent to make current stage-setting moves that set up later moves that are obviously advantageous. The very essence of attaining a competitive advantage, whether it be in chess, economics, or biology, is the discovery and execution of stage-setting moves.
So ultimately what you're describing,
Executive function builds a more complicated internal model.
Right. But ultimately it's a more complicated internal model with the same function.
Same purpose.
It's still stimulus response.
I don't believe so.
It is.
And this is philosophical, and I don't have evidence. I don't have a ton of evidence. I have some evidence for this. I believe that there is agency in the frontal lobe. I believe that there is true...
What is agency, though?
Deep agency, self-direction.
Self-direction?
Self-direction. I believe that there's true, deep agency.
What is self? And by the way, I don't approach this from a philosophical standpoint. For me, this is immediate.
I believe that the frontal lobe grants us, to some degree, freedom from stimulus response.
No, I disagree. In order to have agency, you need a self acting on behalf of. That's agency, right? You invoked self acting on its behalf.
Let me say that a different way. I believe that the executive function is sophisticated enough to allow the agent to choose its own heuristics. So
what is the agent, though?
The agent
is self.
The agent is the organism.
The self is choosing, right?
Yeah, the organism, through its frontal lobe, is choosing which heuristics. Instead of employing the heuristics that you're born with, you now have a tool in your brain that can select the heuristics that you employ.
But is that the same as saying that there is an entity exercising agency, or is that just a more complicated layer or expression of the same process of stimulus response?
Fundamentally different.
How so?
It's not stimulus response. Well, it's meta. It's one level above it. By giving you a system that allows you to choose, and the mechanism of choosing is very complicated, and that's what Berkeley talks about, is the mechanism of that choosing. How does the executive function put that together?
In describing executive function in that method of choosing, he talks about looking back to look ahead, which is this idea of time, which is what you were saying.
That's right.
Which is what I'm saying is all the executive function is doing. It's giving us that capacity to subjectively look back to look ahead. It's giving us that capacity to make predictions that are ultimately in our best self-interest for whatever our environment determines is what we need to be able to do to survive and meet those evolutionary guidelines or sort of rules. And we interpret that, we ideate that. Our thinking on that subjectively is that we create a sense of time. That's what time is. Time is an invention of our minds to, in idea, in words, in language, to express that biological function of pulling from the experiences of the past in order to predict, do a calculation and predict the likelihood of certain outcomes, and then using choose with quotations, and then action arises from whatever that calculation determines is the best outcome, keeping with those very basic rules, the rules of the game, survival and reproduction. But when you invoke ideas like agency and self and choice and freedom, to me, that says that there is a decision happening. That means that there is an entity that is choosing. And I think that that is the illusion of the mind, that we are a self-choosing, which is not the same thing as saying that things are deterministic. But
how is that not the same thing?
Good question. That's a big one.
Because I think it has to be.
Ultimately, the borders and the lines that we put on things are for the purpose of our own functioning, but they are inventions, they're illusions. This is getting back to Zen and meditation, the whole idea of freedom from attachment, which is basically freedom from attachment to concepts, which is the same as definitions, ideas, words. When we say, what was the equilibrium or whatever else? Equanimity. These ideas are inventions of the mind to impose structure where there is none, to impose order on chaos, to weave a narrative out of that chaos. Similar to the blind spot in our vision, we ignore selectively the time lag, or weaving our narratives out of past events. Our stories of our lives are happening, are being created by us in retrospect.
Yeah.
But we don't perceive that difference in time. We perceive it as, this is me. But what is me is just the invention of the mind based on its past experiences.
It could be that we're saying the same thing, because
I think actually that we aren't. I think that we're approaching it from two different sides.
Well, they may not be mutually exclusive, because the concept of me, I wholeheartedly agree, is an illusion. It's an experiential narrative. It's the narrative to end all narratives, so to speak. So
you're right about that.
It's a narrative that we attach to the executive function, and it's almost like the Matrix,
Which is like the Matrix is like a modern day Zen parable.
Well, okay, so I believe that the perception that I have of my agency is largely illusional.
I would say it's entirely
No, I don't think it's entirely illusory, but I think it's largely illusory.
Yeah.
And I believe, and I can't prove this, but if I thought about it, I think I might be able to prove it, that if you take away agency, you end up with behavioral determinism.
And if we're viewing that more realistically, you end up with nihilism. That's when people are saying you can't not believe in God because then the universe, then nothing means anything, and then eventually you fall into nihilistic behavior. Nothing is worthwhile or whatever. Everything becomes pessimistic and negative or cynical.
I believe that it's extremely difficult.
Can I point something out to you?
What?
I've heard you say "I believe" at the beginning of your sentences more in this past 10-minute period than I've ever heard you say before.
Well, it's because what I'm saying now is my belief. I'm not spouting what other people's
beliefs.
Well, I'm not quoting other books. And so I want to make that clear that I think these beliefs are well informed, but they're my beliefs. So my perception is that agency is thin and narrow, meaning we don't have a ton of wiggle room for agency. It's not like radio control robots where our executive function has these radio controls and we have perfect control over our behavior. I think agency at its best can exert maybe 5 to 15% control over what is this mass of like built-in stimulus response heuristics. Our behaviors are a battleship whose direction is extremely hard to change. But I do believe that our biology and this massive computer that we have sitting in the front of our brain imbues on us a degree of freedom in action that other mammals don't have.
You invoked the computer as an analogy for the brain, and ultimately as a programmer, could expose my ignorance to this field, isn't ultimately computer programming just made up of different combinations of ones and zeros? Yeah. It's a very small subset of information, but it's combined in intricate patterns to create newer and more interesting things.
That's right.
So ultimately what I'm saying is that our experience is one that is identical to, we'll say, the horse experience. It's still stimulus response, but it's new and more complicated combinations of what we can do with that produces different response. We're responding to the world. We're responding to the same information, but what's coming back out is what's different. Well, there's different ranges in different animals and sense organs, but that's evolved as well. But ultimately, the input is the same. There's an objective reality that exists in the world. That's the information that's coming in. What comes back out is determined by the filter of the
the behaviors that come out.
That's the output.
Our physical responses is the output to our behavioral system, our survival machine, survival/reproduction machine. That is our wiring.
Right.
And I had a thought there. Now it's gone.
Yeah. You know what happens when you get tired? Your executive system is the first to start to fade out.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so what happens when that happens? Your thoughts don't stay as long.
No, they don't.
Because you're taking your paper... That's a shitty analogy. I shouldn't return to it. But the water is now running more freely through the sieve.
Well, I think you're using it as a metaphor for working memory. And in that case, I think it actually works quite well. But that's just one aspect. Here's the thing. This is what I wanted to say before.
Okay.
So I use the analogy of a computer that's sitting in the front of our brain. And that is absolutely true with one important difference. The difference between our brain and a Dell computer is not quantitative. It's qualitative. Quantitatively, the processing power of our brain is vastly, orders and orders of magnitude superior to the best supercomputers on the planet.
And what I'm saying is that qualitative arises from quantitative. They're not separate.
Qualitatively, no, it doesn't. Because each brain cell in our brain is, oh my God, Daniel Dennett wrote a piece on this that will blow your mind. And I'll get to the specific thing in a second. Our brain is a brain whose circuitry can change in time. Our circuitry can change.
Tell me the most primitive computer program that you can think of.
I'm talking about hardware. I'm not talking about the program that's written on it. I'm talking about the hardware.
Right.
I'm talking about the chip.
But in terms of the thing that is using the ones and the zeros, what is the most primitive? What's the Atari version of a computer program?
Program?
Yeah.
I don't know what the first program was.
Just an old one that comes to your mind. Let's use video games. So let's think of Atari or
Pong was the first video game.
Cool. Let's think of Pong.
Yeah.
Now let's think of what's like a modern, like really intense, like one of these like. I don't play video games.
I don't really play video games.
But imagine like the graphics and just the intensity and the experience of playing a video game today. Mm-hmm. Compare that in your mind to Pong.
Yeah.
Is there a qualitative difference in that experience?
You're talking about the code.
I'm talking about the qualitative experience as arising from the code, which is the quantitative.
But that's software. I'm talking about hardware.
Right, but the hardware develops as an extension of the software.
But today's hardware is a scaled up version of the hardware of Pong.
But ultimately, it's manipulating the same basic building blocks, isn't it? It's just doing it differently and better because it's accumulating the experience of what past hardware has done.
It's
building upon.
It's very straightforward. You've got bits, and then you've got bytes.
Bits and bytes.
You've got bits and bytes.
And that's what we've had, right?
No, but our brains are different.
I don't think they are.
Our brains are different.
I'm not going to say I don't think they are. I know that they are not. What did you say? You're saying they're different.
I'm saying they're qualitatively different because each cell, and this is what Daniel Dennett said, and now I'm facing the microphone.
Good.
Daniel Dennett says, each cell in our brain evolved from a single-celled organism. Each cell in your brain is trying to survive and replicate. Each cell in your brain does not know it is in a brain. It is responding to the same rules of the rest of, all of life.
It's a microcosm of what's happening out here.
A cell that is born in your brain and tries to survive and replicate. Mm-hmm. That's what it does. And it does that under the constraints of an outward... God, there's a great chapter.
This is good.
There's a great chapter in the I'm in Strange Loop book that talks about the difference between the inward and outward manifestation of these things.
And ultimately, what I'm going to drive us towards, but we'll go back to hold that because we're going right back to it, is that the illusion is that there is an inward and an outward. That's an artificial line put on things by the brain. Because what you're saying, the heart, at the basic cellular level, it's not a microcosm, it's an extension of, it's connected to. And so these cells find that their best chance for survival is to operate in units. So in our brain, what we're calling neural circuits and patterns, that's the social, what we think of subjectively in the world as the social element, that's that happening in the brain.
The cells in our brain, each one of them is its own organism.
Yes.
What we call learning, what we call adapting, what we call executive functioning is changing the landscape of behavior of our cells, of our brain cells. So we're changing the landscape of how to replicate these cells over here, how to vary the firing patterns over here, which ones are going to replicate faster, which ones are going to not replicate as fast. We have top-down control.
That's an illusion.
No, it's not an illusion.
Because when you say we are doing this, we are replicating the landscape.
Well, but horses do this.
It's founded on an idea that there is a self that is doing something.
No. Self is a subjective thing. I'm talking about objectively. You can put a brain without...
This is what is happening. What we are doing, this is what is happening.
Without any subjective experience, you can put a human or a horse in an electron... I did that before, electron microscope.
We should do that every
fMRI. Time. You can put a horse in an fMRI, look at the firing patterns...
It would not stay still long enough.
No, probably not. And see that under different situations... the horse is creating different conditions for the survival and replication of its brain cells. We do the same thing.
No, it isn't. It's bottom up. But
it's bottom up and top down.
But it's
both.
What we do, our creation, our cognitive dissonance, our images that we create that are ultimately illusions, but we use them as tools for this process. That is the illusion. Is that there is a top down. It is all bottom up.
No,
because those cells at that smallest cellular level are just responding to stimulus. But the collective response...
These aren't my ideas. The things that I'm telling you, and that I'm telling you passionately, and that I'm modulating my voice to make it seem like the most important thing in the world.
And I'm calling bullshit.
No,
which I told you at the beginning that I would.
You're not calling bullshit. What it seems like you're doing is you're desperately trying to relate your subjective experience to what I'm describing as an objective experience. So... our bodies are complex adaptive systems.
Right.
Every complex adaptive system has bottom up and top down. Every single one. has layers of downward control and layers of bottom-up. Layers of bottom-up too muchness, layers of bottom-up creation, and layers of top-down control. Every single complex adaptive system is the meeting of these bottom-up forces and top-down controls. That is one of the definitions of a complex adaptive system. I'm not making that shit up. There's a shitload of literature.
No, you're not making that shit up, Brian, but here's where I think you're missing the heart of my perspective. All we're doing as humans with these complex brains that you are ascribing agency to are just making shit up. So when you say top-down, bottom-up, when we talk about Zen and this freedom from attachments, when we talk about ideas that give rise to cognitive dissonance because then we need to contort and distort the information coming in to fit the idea, the mode that we've created, that's making shit up. That's ideation. That's the work of the brain. In our example, in our case, in our expression of life as humans, all it is it's an onion with more layers. But ultimately the layers, they're the same stuff. They're the same ones and zeros if we're using the computer analogy. It's just that they're growing in complexity, so it gives rise to this illusion that something different is happening, which is just another idea that we create qualitatively. That's an invention. It's an idea. It's a tool, but it's ultimately something we made up. Qualitative and quantitative are just two descriptors of the same thing. That if we're going to, for the sake of argument, accept them as actual things.
No.
They are not separate.
Qualitative and quantitative, there's a difference. There's a fundamental difference. One of the outcomes of a complex adaptive system is this concept of emergence. Emergence is one of so in complex adaptive systems, you have many interacting agents. When conditions become right, they coordinate and yield what is called an emergent condition, which is the coordination of the activity of many of these things that don't realize that this one is subtly interacting with this one, but there's an emergent outcome that yields a consistent behavior of the group. That's a real thing. It doesn't matter what word you attach to it. That's a real thing.
The difference is whether we are thinking of it from a starting point of observing something that is naturally happening, which is kind of the definition of emergence, or if we are thinking of it as something that something is intentionally doing or exercising agency over. And that's where this idea of free will or just freedom in general comes in, because in order to have free will or in order to have freedom, you have to have something that is exercising that agency. Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Let me ask you two questions, but let me answer this one first. The outer and the inner.
Yeah.
And it sounds philosophical, but it really isn't. The inner and the outer. Tell me where the line is. And this is not somebody else's idea. This is my idea. Where's the border? Is it our skin? Is it the cell wall around our neurons?
That's a trick question.
Is there a difference between outer and inner, or are these artificial borders we put on? We look at a map and we've imposed lines. Here's US, here's Canada, here's Mexico. But ultimately, those lines don't exist. Those are human inventions. We do the same thing on ourselves and on our lives and our experience. Where's the inner, where's the outer? Or is it just the border between Mexico and the US? Are there real borders on things, ultimately?
Well, but that's binary. A subjective experience is a point. There's no border around it. It's not something that has a beginning and end. It is a point of view, and where the operative word is point. To take this back into evolutionary terms, it is a point of information collection and response. It is that point. And the experience of subjectiveness does not have a beginning and end. If it has a beginning and end, it's at birth and death, and you can slip in and out of it at sleep. Thanks. There are no physical extents to it. There are temporal extents to it, but not physical ones.
Ultimately, if we pull the lens back far enough, is there a difference between me and you? Are we separate entities? And within each of us, is there an inner and an outer?
Yes, we are separate entities, and within each of us there is an inner and an outer, an inner and an outer.
Where is the line? Where is it?
Well, to ask where is the line is to confuse the point.
Maybe.
Communication requires intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity is shared mental space, right? Oh God, this is...
Hold on, stay with it.
I'm the strange loop. I need to read that and quote at length, because here's what it seems like. It seems like I'm advocating very strongly for a point, but really what I'm doing is I'm defending my two favorite authors. Mm-hmm. I'm defending Daniel Dennett and I'm defending Douglas Hofstadter.
Okay.
Everything that's coming out of my mouth tonight is conditioned by these two men that are infinitely smarter than myself. And I've read a bunch of other people whose ideas did not jive as well as they do with each other. They've collaborated some. And also with my own perception of things. Mm-hmm. I'm not advocating for something that I've figured out on my own, and I'm not advocating for something that I figured out experientially.
But you're drawn to those ideas for a reason, so maybe it's that they express something that you just have figured out for yourself but haven't found the words for. And maybe when I ask you to put a line on it and say, what's the inner and the outer, and you say, that's confusing the point, maybe it's not. Maybe it's me asking you to give me your fully formed idea that you don't have yet in words. Because when I ask you, on a map where Mexico is, where the U.S. is, where Canada is, we can point to the map, and by identifying the shapes and superimposing with our brains the lines that we know to be there on the map that we look at in the book, we say that's the U.S., that's this. But those aren't real border lines, correct? Ultimately, there's no U.S., there's no Canada, there's no Iraq.
Okay, but
these are the inventions of human.
Our subjective experience is not carved out in space.
What is our subjective experience? And how is it different from objectivity?
Our subjective experience is carved out in time as a tool to help us survive and propagate our genetic material. That is the purpose of our subjective experience.
Right. It's a tool. And what I'm saying is that it's a tool that we have invented, just like actual tools.
Well, it's a tool that it has invented.
Right, that's a good point. Now you're making my point for me. It has invented.
Yeah.
It has arisen, I would say.
Evolution.
Has emerged.
Evolution bestowed upon us subjectivity.
See, when you say evolution bestowed, that's, to me, I hear somebody saying, God made us.
No, there's no God. I don't believe in God at all. But none whatsoever.
Yeah, but what's the difference between you saying evolution bestowed and someone else saying God bestowed?
Well, let me say this a different way.
Evolution and God in your mind and your definition is top down.
No, not even
evolution
close.
It's not intelligent designer.
Not even close. I'm using a conversational shortcut in the same way that Kahneman uses System 1 and System 2 as a literary shortcut to compress a more complicated statement into a simpler one.
Right.
Here is the more complicated statement of what I'm saying. When I say evolution bestowed upon us a subjective experience, here is what I'm saying. Organisms with higher levels of subjectivity and subjective experience survived longer and reproduced more than organisms that didn't, and thus the genetic material that codes for those physical assets became more prevalent in our gene pool. And so we are the beneficiaries of this selection process whereby subjectivity was selected for in the gene pool, and here we are millions and millions of years later with deep, deep senses of subjectivity because it was selected for. It evolved.
Was that selection top down or bottom up? Was it bestowed by evolution, or did it emerge from chaos and randomness?
Well,
and this is an important distinction because it's not just semantical anymore.
The biosphere is a complex adaptive system.
As are we.
As are we. Our organisms are complex adaptive systems. A city is a complex adaptive system, and the biosphere is a complex adaptive system. There's a lot of randomness that's going on. From time to time, there's coordination and emergence. So, what was your question? Is it top down? It's outside in.
Is it evolution bestowing, which is top down, or is it order emerging from chaos?
It's order emerging from chaos. I'm making evolution seem like a purposeful agent.
Right.
And that's not the case. That's not the case at all.
Of course.
And you're right to call me out on that. It's lazy and
sloppy is what it is.
It's sloppy is what it is, and it's a shortcut. But it's a convenient shortcut, but if you take that shortcut too often, particularly in the context of what we're talking about, it can make it seem like the point I'm arguing for is not what I'm actually arguing for. So yes, subjectivity was selected for by outside forces, meaning in some cases it could be a comet hitting the Earth, in some cases it could be animals that are eating other animals. In some cases, it could be just getting your leg stuck in a swamp. Or in some cases, it could just be not having reproductive success.
Going back to the question of the inner versus the outer in the line, and me saying that there is no actual line, but that we've imposed it for a reason as a tool. I don't need you to describe your face to me. Why? I can see your face. But I need you to describe what is happening on the inside, which is what subjectivity is. It's our awareness or our ability to ideate and then transcribe and communicate our inner experience.
That's right.
But ultimately, it's a tool to communicate something that I can't, as being outside of you, can't physically see.
That's right.
It's only a functional tool for a purpose, but it's just like a shovel. We made up shovels. There are no shovel trees in the world. Shovels are not a naturally occurring thing in this larger sense. We invented them. Ultimately, they are inventions of the human mind. They are not naturally occurring entities. We invented them as a tool for a purpose, for a function. The same is happening with these borders that we draw in subjectivity, objectivity, inner, outer, top down, bottom up. These are artificial creations of the mind.
Well, what does artificial mean?
It means it is an invention that emerges, actually, from our functioning. What I'm saying as my premise is that if you pull back the lens far enough, which I think is the ultimate goal of Zen, to get back to some sort of a thread to this conversation, if you pull the lens back far enough, the lines disappear on the map. But the lines were put there. There are no lines on the map, right? Think of Google Earth.
Yeah.
There are no actual lines on the map. If we're out in space, we don't see grids.
Turn the filters off.
We put the grids there. They're not real. They don't actually exist. Human minds invented them for a function, for a purpose.
Horses have agency, and the horse brain did not invent horse agency.
I don't acknowledge agency as a real occurrence, as a real phenomenon.
Subjectivity is all the way down the ladder. Subjectivity is something that exists in degrees, not is binary. Mice have a little bit of subjectivity. Mosquitoes, less subjectivity.
There you go. The title of that book, by the way, totally blows this open. What's this?
That is your cone of subjectivity. Lots of consciousness. Less, but some consciousness. Little or no consciousness.
Right, but this is an example of exactly what I'm talking about. This is a diagram. This is an invention for the purpose of communicating an idea. Ultimately, the idea is an invention itself. The larger purpose of any of this is ultimately going to be traced back to the goals of evolution, of survival and reproduction. It's just more complicated layers to the same purpose. It's a more complicated computer program that over time has given rise to innovation that has created newer and more sophisticated hardware. But ultimately, the building blocks, the input is the same. It's ones and zeros. It's just that by adjusting and developing the filters on those ones and zeros and creating more complex combinations, the output changes. And the only reason the output would change was because the output already changed, and everything else that is in the same race needs to keep up, because you either have to survive and adapt or die. You need to move or you're over.
Yeah.
So it's all just that process unfolding, and there's no agency. It's all part of one strange loop. It's all going in circles. There's no place you could stop and say, that's it. There's no line that you could say, this is where the inner becomes the outer. There is no inner outer. We've invented them like...
Who's we?
Exactly. That's my mistake in language. Because my point is that there is no we inventing. Ultimately, these are just phenomena emerging. And that even the act of our brains putting these artificial lines on them for the purpose of the function of communication, understanding, sort of setting the rules to the game that we're making up ultimately so that we can all play. And the game is the way of our more complicated, sophisticated way of ultimately doing the same thing that the horse is doing or the tiger. It's all about survival and reproduction. And it's using the same basic building blocks. The input is always the same. It's the filter we put on it. Like the magnifying glass. The input is the same, but what we put in between the sun's rays as the input and that ant is what's going to change the output, which is either the ant is just in the sunshine or it's on fire. And the extent of the complexity indicates the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex in general, which is just newer and sophisticated filters on the input that change the output. Ultimately, that change is quantitative, it's just numerical, it's just more complicated. And then subjectively, just to use that word for the sake of having a conversation, we create this idea of qualitative as a way of saying, now at some point, we're saying this is a new thing. But we've put that line there. What am I hearing? Is that you? Oh, you hit the...
It's Siri yelling at me.
See, even Siri wants you to hear this, man. Siri's saying, it's all an illusion. It's all the Matrix.
It's not an illusion. It's a real thing.
What's real? What are you saying is real?
Our subjective experience is real.
No, absolutely not. It is our ideation. It is an invention that emerges from our brains, which ultimately are just loops. In other words, you can't trace it back to anything.
No, you can't trace it back to any...
Because it's...
You can't trace it back to any one thing, but you can trace it back to the system. It's an emergent outcome of the system.
When you say the system, and I'm not saying this to be insulting, I'm saying this because, to me, this is very, very clear and obvious. And my only lack, which causes the frustration and the friction and heat to build in me, is my inability to articulate it the way that I want it to be. When you even invoke this idea of a system, that's religion. That's inventing
If you cut open a brain, you see cells. I'm not making that up. I didn't invent that. That's a system. That's a system of cells. I'm not talking about from the inside. I'm talking about from the outside looking in. That's a system of cells. You cut a brain open.
What is a system?
A system is a collection of interacting parts.
So there's an in-group and an out-group to a system. Because by definition, if there is a collection of parts working together, then there must be other parts surrounding that collection of parts that are not working directly with those parts.
In the case of the human body, that is absolutely true. That's why we have an immune system.
And an immune system is in a different domain, serving the same function as the executive functions of the brain. It's all just our ability to Thoreau writes about this when he talks about the primary purpose. He's trying to get at the heart of what can we boil this all down to? And ultimately nothing. But what he arrives at is it's all about maintaining the fundamental heat. We need to retain heat in order to survive. Let me go get my book now. I wish I had the word. There is a word, and I think that's where my frustration is coming from. Because this word, it's not filter. It's a better word that traps something in. It's not a net, it's not a sieve or a colander.
Oh, fuck, it's 5 after 12. We've really gotten lost here.
No, we are not lost. We are found. When we consider, this is from the first pages of Walden, interestingly titled, the first chapter, Economy. When we consider what, to use the words of the Catechism, because he pulls from everywhere, just like I do. He had ADD too. When we consider what, to use the words of the Catechism, is the chief end of man, and what are the true necessaries and means of life. So he's approaching these same questions. It appears as if men had deliberately chosen the common mode of living because they preferred it to any other. Fuck, I didn't know this was this directly related. Yet they honestly think that there is no choice left. But alert and healthy natures remember that the sun rose clear. It is never too late to give up our prejudices. I'm not calling you prejudice, by the way. No way of thinking or doing, however ancient, can be trusted without proof. Okay, this is blah, 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 blah. Old deeds for old people, new deeds for new. Old people did not know enough once, perchance, to fetch fresh fuel to keep the fire going. New people put a little dry wood under a pot and are whirled around the globe with the speed of birds, in a way to kill old people, as the phrase is. I think we touched on that earlier, didn't we?
Yeah.
Age is no better, hardly so well qualified for an instructor as youth, for it has not profited so much as it has lost. One may almost doubt if the wisest man has learned anything of absolute value by living. Practically, the old have no very important advice to give the young. Their own experience has been so partial, and their lives have been such miserable failures for private reasons, as they must believe. And it may be that they have some faith left which belies that experience, and they are only less young than they were. I have lived some 30 years on this planet, and I have yet to hear the first syllable of valuable or even earnest advice from my seniors. They have told me nothing and probably cannot tell me anything to the purpose. Here is life, an experiment to a great extent untried by me, but it does not avail me that they have tried it. If I have any experience which I think valuable, I am sure to reflect that this my mentor said nothing about. Now I'm just fucking reading this because this is brilliant. This wasn't the point I was searching for. I could literally read this entire chapter. Everything is connected to what we were saying. But let me find the thing I was looking for. Confucius said, to know that we know what we know, and that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge. When one man has reduced a fact of the imagination to be a fact to his understanding, I foresee that all men will at length establish their lives on that basis. That's the serenity prayer.
Yeah, basically.
That's what we were saying. This is the crux of the issue of subjective versus objective and the illusions of the mind and cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is somebody who confuses a fact of the imagination to be an objective fact.
I'm not saying that...
No, I know you're not.
I'm not saying that our perception is not subject to illusion. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that the entirety of it is not an illusion. We do indeed have subjective... we have consciousness. We have that. That's a thing we have. We've evolved to have it. The layers of it, the way it manifests itself, we can think one thing and think we're in control of it and be totally full of shit about that.
Right.
And this gets to like the 5 to 15%. Our brain is designed to think that it's in control all the time.
Right.
And it's not. That part is a total illusion. What I'm saying is that there's this small amount of top-down control that is not an illusion. It's a sliver.
But you're only rejecting part of the original illusion that you just illustrated, because in order for the brain to think that it is in control, it must think that it is separate. So it must, just like a map, it must create a grid on top of itself. It imposes a
No, it does it without knowing that. It does.
No, of course it does. This is what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that in order for the brain to even have this idea of it being in control, it must put borderlines on itself and see it as separate.
But it makes these decisions without thinking that so the brain is not aware that it's two systems or that it's this hierarchy of system. It just sees itself as this unity, and that's the illusion, that it's a unity. It's not a unity. It's this hierarchical system.
I'm saying that it is the opposite of that it is absolutely a unity, and that it is the one that, in order to create function in the use of the tool of itself, is creating hierarchy, is creating ideas, is creating subdivisions of its experience, which is ultimately what gives rise to the experience of a subjective self or subjective experience.
But subjectivity feels like a unity. It feels like...
Well, of course it would.
One
just
thing.
Just like having sex feels awesome, but ultimately that feeling is our subjective experience. It's illusion. It's a trick. It's not even really a trick, because that implies agency too, and I'm really trying hard to get away from saying things that imply agency.
Why are you so against agency?
I'm not against. Not against. I am trying desperately, not just in this conversation, but in my life. And it's not even I'm trying. This is my emerging experience.
Yeah.
To articulate in a way that feels satisfying to me what I have come to realize. When I'm speaking in our conversations, I'm not citing... I say that as I'm holding Walden, but I'm not citing other people's ideas, and when I do, I'm using it to try to illustrate my idea, which is ultimately just a semantical way of trying to make a point, because there's no me having an idea. And it gets back to the start of this conversation, Zen, the true meaning of Zen, the true meaning of enlightenment, meditation, all of these sort of systems of thought. The ultimate goal and aim is erasing all of the lines. Or not erasing the lines, because you need the lines. The lines are there because they're needed, but seeing them as artificial, seeing them as not real, because that's the definition of the release of attachment. We don't exercise agency. We don't figure out how to, or meditate enough where then we release our attachments. When we see that the lines are not real, attachment disappears. That's a horrible time to get gas.
Okay, there it is. Part 2 of Episode 7. May it be of benefit. Or not, whatever. This is Mike McCusker for BlindSpots. Look for Part 3 of Episode 7, likely the conclusion, the final installment of this saga, very soon. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.